The bustling streets of New York City were alive with the usual cacophony of honking horns and chattering pedestrians as Sarah Thompson hurried down the sidewalk, her worn sneakers slapping against the concrete. Her long chestnut hair was hastily tied back in a messy ponytail, and her green eyes darted nervously from side to side as she weaved through the crowd. She was running late for her shift. At the Golden Spoon, a high-end restaurant where she worked as a waitress to make ends meet. As she burst through the back door of the restaurant, Sarah was immediately accosted by her manager, Mr. Harrison, a portly man with a perpetual scowl etched onto his face. "Thompson, you're late again," he barked, his jowls quivering with each syllable. "One more slip-up, and you're out on the street. Got it?" Sarah nodded meekly, her eyes downcast. "Yes, Mr. Harrison. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," he growled before waddling back to his office. With a heavy sigh, Sarah made her way to the employee locker room, quickly changing into her crisp white shirt and black slacks. As she tied her apron around her waist, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes, a testament to the long nights she spent studying for her online classes after her grueling shifts at the restaurant. At 25 years old, Sarah had already faced more hardships than most people experience in a lifetime. Orphaned at a young age, she had bounced from foster home to foster home, never quite finding a place where she truly belonged. Now, she was struggling to put herself through college while working full-time, determined to build a better life for herself. As she stepped out onto the restaurant floor, Sarah plastered on her best smile, ready to face another night of demanding customers and meager tips. Little did she know that this evening would change the course of her life forever. The Golden Spoon was buzzing with activity, the soft clink of silverware against fine china mingling with the low murmur of conversation. Sarah moved gracefully between the tables, refilling water glasses and taking orders with practiced efficiency. Despite the challenges she faced outside of work, she took pride in her job and always strived to provide excellent service. As the night wore on, Sarah's section began to thin out, save for one table in the corner. A group of well-dressed businessmen had been occupying the booth for hours, their loud laughter and boisterous conversation drawing irritated glances from other patrons. Sarah approached the table with caution, her instincts warning her that trouble was brewing. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said politely, "is there anything else I can get for you this evening?" One of the men, a silver-haired executive with cold blue eyes, turned to face her. His gaze raked over her dismissively, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. Well, he drawled, his words slightly slurred from the expensive whiskey he'd been consuming all night. "If it isn't our little serving girl. Tell me, sweetheart, don't you think it's time you found a real job? Or are you content to spend your life catering to your betters?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "Sir, I assure you that my job is very real, and I take great pride in my work. Now, if there's nothing else you need, dash." The man cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Pride? In what? Carrying plates and wiping tables? Come now, surely you can aim higher than that. Or perhaps this is all someone like you is capable of." Sarah's hands began to tremble, and she clenched them tightly at her sides. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as she noticed the other diners turning to watch the scene unfold. The silver-haired man seemed to relish the attention, his voice growing louder as he continued his tirade. "I bet you didn't even finish high school, did you? It's people like you who are the reason this country is going downhill. No ambition, no drive. Just leeches on society, content to scrape by on minimum wage and handouts." Tears pricked at the corners of Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't give this cruel man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Just as she was about to turn and flee, a hand gently grasped her shoulder. Sarah looked up to see an elderly woman standing beside her, her kind eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Young man," the woman addressed the silver-haired executive, her voice ringing clear and strong through the now silent restaurant. "I suggest you take a good, hard look at yourself before passing judgment on others. This young lady has shown nothing but patience and professionalism in the face of your abhorrent behavior. She is worth 10 of you." The businessman sputtered, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy and sell this entire establishment without breaking a sweat." The elderly woman remained unimpressed. "Money may buy many things, sir, but it cannot purchase class or character, both of which you seem to be sorely lacking." A ripple of murmurs swept through the restaurant, and Sarah noticed several patrons nodding in agreement. The silver-haired man glanced around, suddenly aware that he had lost his audience's sympathy. "Come on, boys," he grumbled to his companions. "Let's get out of this dump." He threw a wad of cash on the table and stormed out, his group trailing behind him like chastened schoolchildren. As the door slammed shut behind them, the restaurant erupted in applause. Sarah turned to thank the elderly woman, but to her surprise, she had already returned to her seat at a nearby table. Still shaken, Sarah made her way back to the kitchen, her mind reeling from the encounter. She had faced her share of rude customers before, but never had she been so publicly humiliated. As she pushed through the swinging doors, she nearly collided with Mr. Harrison. "Thompson," he barked, his face an odd mixture of concern and annoyance. "My office, now." Sarah's heart sank. She was sure she was about to be fired, punished for a situation that had been entirely out of her control. With leaden feet, she followed her manager to his cramped office at the back of the restaurant. Mr. Harrison settled into his creaky chair, fixing Sarah with an unreadable expression. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Sarah perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Harrison, I'm so sorry about what happened out there. I didn't mean to cause a scene, I dash." He held up a hand, cutting off her apology. "Save it, Thompson. I saw the whole thing. That pompous windbag had it coming." He leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "You handled yourself well out there. Not many people could keep their cool in a situation like that." Sarah blinked in surprise, unsure of how to respond. Was this the same Mr. Harrison who had threatened to fire her just hours ago? "Thank you, sir," she managed to stammer out. Mr. Harrison nodded, then leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. "Listen, Thompson. I know I've been hard on you. Truth is, I see a lot of potential in you. You're a hard worker, and you've got a good head on your shoulders. But I also know you're stretched thin, trying to balance this job with your studies." Sarah's eyes widened. How did he know about her classes? As if reading her mind, Mr. Harrison chuckled. "You're not the only one who stays late around here, kid. I've seen you studying in the break room after your shifts." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the desk toward her. "I want you to take this. It's not much, but it should help ease some of the financial burden. Consider it a scholarship of sorts, from the Golden Spoon." With trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. She gasped, unable to believe her eyes. "Mr. Harrison, I can't accept this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He waved away her protest. "You can, and you will. You've earned it, Sarah. Just promise me one thing, when you've finished your degree and you're out there changing the world, remember where you came from. And maybe put in a good word for us little people back at the Golden Spoon, eh?" For the first time that night, Sarah felt tears of joy spill down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I promise, I won't let you down." As she left Mr. Harrison's office, Sarah felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The cruel words of the silver-haired man still stung, but they were overshadowed by the kindness she had experienced in the aftermath. Little did Sarah know, her night of surprises was far from over. As she stepped back onto the restaurant floor, she noticed that the elderly woman who had come to her defense was preparing to leave. Determined to express her gratitude, Sarah hurried over to her table. "Ma'am," she began, her voice filled with sincerity, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did earlier. It means more to me than you could know." The woman looked up at her, a warm smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "My dear, you have nothing to thank me for. I only spoke the truth. In my experience, it's often those who have faced the greatest hardships who possess the strongest character." Sarah felt a connection to this kind stranger, a sense that she truly understood the struggles she had faced. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending her hand. The woman clasped it warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Sarah. I'm Eleanor Whitmore." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor Whitmore was one of the most renowned philanthropists in New York City, known for her generous contributions to education and social welfare programs. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah stammered, I had no idea. Your work has been an inspiration to me. In fact, it's one of the reasons I'm studying social work." Eleanor's eyes lit up with interest. "Is that so?" "Well, Sarah, I think perhaps our meeting tonight was no accident. Tell me, do you have plans after your shift? I'd very much like to continue our conversation." Sarah glanced at the clock, noting that her shift was nearly over. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Whitmore." As Sarah finished up her duties and prepared to leave with Eleanor, she couldn't help but feel that her life was on the cusp of a great change. The cruelty she had faced earlier in the evening had given way to unexpected kindness and opportunity. Walking out of the Golden Spoon that night, Sarah Thompson was no longer just a struggling waitress. She was a young woman with renewed hope, standing on the threshold of a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. Little did she know, the twists and turns that awaited her would test her resilience, challenge her convictions, and ultimately reveal a truth about her own identity that would leave everyone who knew her absolutely stunned. The New York City night air was crisp and invigorating as Sarah Thompson stepped out of the Golden Spoon, her mind still reeling from the evening's events. Beside her walked Eleanor Whitmore, the renowned philanthropist whose unexpected intervention had turned Sarah's night of humiliation into one of hope and possibility. As they made their way down the bustling sidewalk, Eleanor linked her arm through Sarah's, her warm presence a stark contrast to the cold indifference Sarah had faced earlier from the silver-haired executive. "My dear," Eleanor began, her voice gentle but filled with purpose, "I believe that our meeting tonight was more than mere coincidence. Tell me, what made you choose social work as your field of study?" Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore, I grew up in the foster care system. I've seen firsthand how a little kindness and support can change a person's life. I want to be that change for others, to give them the chances I wished I'd had growing up." Eleanor nodded, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "A noble goal, indeed. And please, call me Eleanor. I have a feeling we're going to become good friends." As they turned the corner, a sleek black town car pulled up alongside them. The driver, an older gentleman with a kind face, stepped out and opened the rear door. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with a slight bow, "your car is ready." Eleanor thanked him, then turned to Sarah. "Why don't you join me? I'd love to continue our conversation, and I have a proposition that might interest you." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her natural caution warring with the inexplicable trust she felt towards Eleanor. Finally, she nodded and slid into the plush leather seat beside the older woman. As the car glided smoothly through the city streets, Eleanor began to speak, her words painting a picture of possibility that made Sarah's heart race with excitement. "Sarah, I've been looking for someone like you for a long time. Someone with first-hand experience of the system, someone with the drive and compassion to make real change. I'd like to offer you an internship with the Whitmore Foundation. It would be part-time, allowing you to continue your studies, but it would give you invaluable experience in the field." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Mrs. Whittam, I mean, Eleanor, that's incredibly generous, but why me? You don't even know me." Eleanor's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "My dear, I've lived long enough to trust my instincts. And my instincts are telling me that you're something special." As the car pulled up to a stately brownstone, Eleanor handed Sarah a business card. "Think about it. Call me tomorrow with your decision." Still in a daze, Sarah thanked Eleanor and stepped out of the car. As she watched the town car disappear into the night, she clutched the business card to her chest, feeling as though her life had suddenly veered onto an entirely new path. The next morning, Sarah woke early, her mind buzzing with excitement and trepidation. She had tossed and turned all night, weighing the incredible opportunity Eleanor had offered her against her fears and self-doubt. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through her tiny apartment window, she made her decision. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number on Eleanor's card. After 2 rings, Eleanor's warm voice answered. "Good morning, Sarah. I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you." Sarah took a deep breath. "Good morning, Eleanor. I'd like to accept your offer, if it's still open." She could almost hear the smile in Eleanor's voice. "Wonderful. Why don't you come by the foundation office this afternoon? We can discuss the details and get you started." As Sarah hung up the phone, a mix of emotions washed over her. Excitement, nervousness, and a small niggling fear that this was all too good to be true. Little did she know, her acceptance of Eleanor's offer was about to set in motion a chain of events that would uncover long-buried secrets and challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and her past. Later that day, Sarah found herself standing in front of an imposing glass and steel building in the heart of Manhattan. The Whitmore Foundation occupied the top 3 floors, and as Sarah rode the elevator up, she couldn't help but feel out of place in her simple blouse and skirt. Eleanor greeted her warmly as she stepped off the elevator, immediately putting Sarah at ease. As they toured the office, introducing Sarah to the various team members, Eleanor explained more about the foundation's work and Sarah's role as an intern. "We focus on education and social welfare programs," Eleanor explained, "particularly for children in the foster care system. Your insights will be invaluable as we develop new initiatives." As they settled into Eleanor's spacious office, the older woman's expression became more serious. "Sarah, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. Something of a more personal nature." Sarah leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What is it, Eleanor?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes searching Sarah's face. "When you mentioned that you grew up in foster care, it struck a chord with me. You see, many years ago, I had a daughter. She was taken from me under complicated circumstances. I've been searching for her ever since." Sarah's heart began to race. "Eleanor, are you saying?" The older woman held up a hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't want to get ahead of myself. But there's something about you, Sarah. A familiarity I can't explain. Would you be willing to take a DNA test? Just to be sure?" Sarah's mind was reeling. Could it be possible? After all these years of wondering about her birth parents, could the answer have quite literally walked into her life? She nodded, unable to form words. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Sarah threw herself into her new internship, soaking up knowledge and experience like a sponge. She found herself thriving in the fast-paced environment of the foundation, her natural empathy and first-hand experience making her a valuable asset to the team. All the while, she and Eleanor anxiously awaited the results of the DNA test. Despite her best efforts to temper her expectations, Sarah couldn't help but dream of finally having a family, of belonging somewhere. Finally, the day arrived. Eleanor called Sarah into her office, her face unreadable as she held an envelope in her trembling hands. "The results are in," Eleanor said softly. "Are you ready?" Sarah nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Eleanor must be able to hear it. With agonizing slowness, Eleanor opened the envelope and scanned its contents. As she read, her expression shifted from tension to shock, and finally to joy. "Sarah," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "it's true. You're my daughter." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah absorbed the news. Emotions she couldn't even name washed over her in waves: relief, joy, confusion, and a deep, aching sense of finally coming home. As Eleanor enveloped her in a warm embrace, Sarah allowed herself to cry, years of loneliness and uncertainty pouring out of her. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely loved. But even as she reveled in this newfound connection, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. This revelation, as wonderful as it was, would undoubtedly bring complications. And Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story of her separation from Eleanor than she yet knew. In the days that followed, Sarah and Eleanor spent every spare moment together, making up for lost time. Eleanor shared stories of Sarah's father, a kind and brilliant man who had passed away before Sarah was born. She spoke of the difficult decision she had made to give Sarah up for adoption, believing at the time that it was the only way to protect her from unnamed dangers. As Sarah absorbed this information, she found herself torn between her joy at finding her mother and her loyalty to the experiences that had shaped her. She couldn't help but wonder how different her life might have been if she had grown up with Eleanor. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner in Eleanor's elegant penthouse apartment, Sarah finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "Mom," she began, still marveling at how natural the word felt on her tongue, "why did you really give me up? What were you protecting me from?" Eleanor's face clouded, a mixture of pain and fear flickering in her eyes. She set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "Sarah, my darling, it's a long and complicated story. One that I'm not sure you're ready to hear." But Sarah pressed on, her need for truth overriding her desire to spare Eleanor's feelings. "Please, Mom. I need to know. I've spent my whole life wondering about my past. Now that I've found you, I need to understand." Eleanor sighed deeply, seeming to age years in a matter of moments. "Very well. But please remember, everything I did out of love for you." As Eleanor began her tale, Sarah listened with growing disbelief. She spoke of a powerful family, the Blackwoods, who had wielded immense influence in New York's social and business circles for generations. Eleanor had fallen in love with Sarah's father, James Thompson, a brilliant young lawyer who had been investigating the Blackwoods for corruption and fraud. When James got too close to exposing their crimes, they had him killed, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I was already pregnant with you. I knew that if they found out about you, they would stop at nothing to control you, to use you as leverage against me. So I made the heartbreaking decision to hide you, to give you up for adoption to keep you safe." Sarah's mind was reeling. The silver-haired executive who had humiliated her at the Golden Spoon, she suddenly realized with a jolt that he must have been a Blackwood. Was it possible that he had recognized something familiar in her features? "But Mom," Sarah said, struggling to process this information, "why come forward now? Aren't you worried about the Blackwoods finding out about me?" Eleanor reached across the table, clasping Sarah's hand in her own. My darling, I've spent the last 25 years building my own power and influence. The Whitmore Foundation isn't just a charity, it's my way of fighting back against the Blackwoods and others like them. I believe we're finally in a position where we can stand up to them, together. As the weight of Eleanor's words sank in, Sarah felt a mix of emotions churning within her. Pride at her mother's strength and resilience. Fear at the thought of the powerful enemies they faced. And a growing determination to uncover the full truth of her family's history. Little did Sarah know, her quest for answers would lead her down a dangerous path, one that would test her newfound relationship with Eleanor and force her to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. As she stepped into this new chapter of her life, Sarah Thompson, once a humble waitress, now the heir to a powerful legacy, was about to discover that some secrets are better left buried, and that the price of truth can be higher than she ever imagined. The next morning, Sarah woke early, her mind still buzzing with the revelations of the previous night. As she prepared for another day at the Whitmore Foundation, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had become something out of a movie, rags to riches, long-lost family found, and now a shadowy conspiracy threatening it all. She arrived at the office to find Eleanor already hard at work, poring over documents spread across her desk. When Sarah entered, Eleanor looked up, a mix of love and worry evident in her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," Eleanor said, gesturing for Sarah to take a seat. "I hope you slept well. I know last night's conversation was a lot to take in." Sarah nodded, settling into the chair across from her mother. "It was," she admitted. "But I'm glad you told me the truth. I want to help, Mom. I want to fight back against the Blackwoods, to finish what my father started." Eleanor's expression softened with pride, but there was a hint of fear in her voice as she spoke. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Sarah, but we need to be careful. The Blackwoods are not to be underestimated. We need to move cautiously, gather evidence, and build our case slowly and methodically." As they discussed their plans, a knock at the office door interrupted them. Eleanor's assistant poked her head in, an apologetic look on her face. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Whitmore, but there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Eleanor frowned, clearly not expecting any visitors. "Who is it, Amanda?" "He says his name is Michael Blackwood, ma'am." The color drained from Eleanor's face, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race. The Blackwoods had found them. Eleanor quickly composed herself, years of practice in high society circles coming to her aid. "Very well, Amanda. Please show Mr. Blackwood in." As Amanda left to fetch their unexpected guest, Eleanor turned to Sarah, her voice low and urgent. "Sarah, listen to me carefully. No matter what happens, do not let on that you know anything about your true identity or our relationship. As far as anyone knows, you're simply a promising intern I've taken under my wing. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. She had barely processed her own identity, now she had to hide it. The door opened, and in walked a man Sarah recognized immediately, the silver-haired executive who had humiliated her at the Golden Spoon. Michael Blackwood cut an imposing figure in his expertly tailored suit, his cold blue eyes sweeping the room before settling on Eleanor. "Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth as silk but with an underlying edge of steel. "It's been far too long." Eleanor rose to greet him, her demeanor cool and collected. "Michael, this is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to the Whitmore Foundation?" Michael's gaze flickered to Sarah, a flash of curiosity crossing his face before he returned his attention to Eleanor. "I was hoping we could speak privately. It's a matter of some delicacy." Eleanor nodded, then turned to Sarah. "Sarah, would you mind giving us the room? Perhaps you could go over the Johnson case files while you wait." Sarah stood, fighting to keep her expression neutral despite the turmoil roiling inside her. As she moved to leave, Michael's voice stopped her. "Wait a moment. Haven't we met before, young lady?" Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly, meeting Michael's piercing gaze. I'm not sure, sir. I don't believe so." Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, a predatory smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No, I'm certain of it. You were our waitress at the Golden Spoon the other night, weren't you? My, what an interesting career change." Eleanor smoothly interjected, her voice calm but with a hint of steel. "Sarah is one of our most promising interns, Michael. She's pursuing her degree in social work while gaining practical experience with us. Now, if you don't mind, I believe you said you had a private matter to discuss?" Michael held Sarah's gaze for a moment longer before nodding and turning back to Eleanor. As Sarah slipped out of the office, she could feel his eyes boring into her back. Once outside, Sarah leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. She had faced down Michael Blackwood twice now, and both times she had felt like prey in the presence of a dangerous predator. But now, knowing what she did about her family's history, that fear was tinged with a burning anger and determination. As she made her way to her small cubicle, Sarah's mind was whirling. What did Michael Blackwood want with her mother? Was it just a coincidence that he had shown up now, so soon after she and Eleanor had reunited? And most pressingly, had he recognized something in her face, some resemblance to the man his family had supposedly murdered? Sarah tried to focus on the Johnson case files as Eleanor had instructed, but her attention kept drifting to the closed door of her mother's office. What was being said behind those walls? What new dangers were brewing? After what felt like hours but was likely only 30 minutes, the door to Eleanor's office opened. Sarah looked up to see Michael Blackwood striding out, his face an unreadable mask. As he passed her cubicle, he paused, those cold blue eyes finding her once again. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice low and silky. "I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other very soon. Do take care." With that cryptic statement, Michael Blackwood turned on his heel and strode towards the elevator, leaving Sarah frozen in place, her mind reeling from the encounter. As soon as the elevator doors closed behind him, Sarah rushed to Eleanor's office, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She found Eleanor standing by the window, her normally composed features etched with worry. When Sarah entered, Eleanor turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sarah, darling, are you all right?" Eleanor asked, moving to embrace her daughter. Sarah nodded, returning the hug before pulling back to look at her mother. "I'm fine, but what about you? What did Michael Blackwood want?" Eleanor sighed heavily, sinking into her chair. "It's complicated. The Blackwoods are planning a major business merger, one that could give them even more power and influence. They want the Whitmore Foundation's endorsement to help smooth over some ethical concerns." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "And they think you'd actually give it to them? After everything they've done?" "Of course not," Eleanor said firmly. "But outright refusal could be dangerous. We need to be smart about this, Sarah. We need to find a way to stop them without putting ourselves in the crosshairs." As they discussed potential strategies, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The timing of Michael Blackwood's visit, so soon after her reunion with Eleanor, seemed too coincidental. Over the next few weeks, Sarah threw herself into her work at the foundation, all while secretly investigating the Blackwoods' proposed merger. She pored over financial reports, dug into the companies involved, and even reached out to some of her contacts from her waitressing days who had connections in the business world. What she uncovered was shocking. The merger wasn't just unethical, it was potentially illegal. The Blackwoods were planning to absorb a string of smaller companies, many of which had been struggling due to what appeared to be deliberate sabotage. If the merger went through, thousands of people would lose their jobs, and the Blackwoods would gain control of key industries. As Sarah presented her findings to Eleanor, she could see the pride and worry warring in her mother's eyes. "This is impressive work, Sarah," Eleanor said, scanning the documents spread across her desk. "But it's also incredibly dangerous. If the Blackwoods find out what we know..." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "We can't let them get away with this, Mom. We have to stop them." Eleanor nodded slowly, a plan already forming in her mind. "You're right. But we need to be smart about this. We need irrefutable evidence, and we need to make sure it gets into the right hands." Over the next month, Sarah and Eleanor worked tirelessly, building their case against the Blackwoods. They gathered testimonies from employees of the targeted companies, uncovered paper trails of the sabotage, and compiled financial records that showed the true nature of the merger. All the while, Sarah felt as though she were living a double life. By day, she was the eager intern, learning the ropes of the foundation and occasionally crossing paths with Michael Blackwood, who seemed to find more and more reasons to visit the Whitmore offices. By night, she was a detective, piecing together the puzzle of the Blackwoods' corruption. As they neared the completion of their investigation, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Small things, a car that seemed to follow her home, a clicking sound on her phone line, shadows moving in the periphery of her vision, all added to her growing paranoia. Then, one evening as Sarah was working late at the office, she received a cryptic text message from an unknown number: "Parking garage. Level B2. 10 minutes. Come alone if you want the truth." Every instinct told Sarah it was a trap, but her burning desire for answers overrode her caution. She left a quick note for Eleanor, who had stepped out for a dinner meeting, and made her way to the parking garage. The underground level was dimly lit and eerily quiet. Sarah's footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as she moved deeper into the garage, her heart pounding in her chest. As she rounded a corner, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm here. What's this about?" The figure stepped into the light, and Sarah gasped. It was Amanda, Eleanor's assistant. "Amanda? What's going on? Why all the secrecy?" Amanda's face was etched with fear and determination. "Sarah, I don't have much time. They'll realize I'm gone soon. But you need to know the truth about Eleanor, about the Blackwoods, about everything." Over the next few minutes, Amanda revealed a story that shook Sarah to her core. Eleanor wasn't just fighting against the Blackwoods, she had once been one of them. Sarah's father, James Thompson, had indeed been investigating the family for corruption, but it was Eleanor who had fallen in love with him and turned against her own family. "The Blackwoods didn't kill your father, Sarah," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor did. Or at least, she believes she did. It was an accident, they struggled, and he fell. But the guilt has eaten at her ever since. Everything she's done, the foundation, taking you in, it's all been an attempt to atone." Sarah felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath her feet. "No," she said, shaking her head in denial. "No, that can't be true. My mother wouldn't, she couldn't." But even as she protested, pieces began to fall into place. Eleanor's reluctance to talk about the past, the pain in her eyes whenever Sarah's father was mentioned, the almost desperate way she had thrown herself into her charitable works. Before Sarah could fully process this revelation, the screech of tires echoed through the garage. Amanda's eyes widened in fear. "They're here," she said. "Sarah, you need to run. Take this." She pressed a USB drive into Sarah's hand. It has everything, proof of the Blackwood's crimes, and of what really happened to your father. Be careful who you trust, Sarah. Even those closest to you." With that, Amanda disappeared into the shadows, leaving Sarah alone and reeling. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Sarah snapped out of her daze and ran, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. She emerged from the parking garage into the cool night air, gasping for breath. Without thinking, she hailed a cab and gave the driver Eleanor's home address. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The ride to Eleanor's penthouse was a blur. Sarah's mind raced, trying to reconcile the loving mother she had come to know with the woman Amanda had described. As the elevator ascended to Eleanor's floor, Sarah steeled herself for the confrontation to come. She found Eleanor in her study, a glass of wine in hand as she looked out over the twinkling lights of the city. When Sarah burst in, Eleanor turned, her face lighting up at the sight of her daughter before quickly clouding with concern. "Sarah? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah stood in the doorway, her whole body trembling. "Tell me it isn't true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you didn't kill my father." The color drained from Eleanor's face, and the wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice heavy with years of suppressed pain and guilt. "Oh, Sarah. My darling girl. I never wanted you to find out like this." As Eleanor began to explain, filling in the gaps of the story Amanda had started, Sarah felt as though her world was crumbling around her. The mother she had longed for all her life, the woman she had come to admire and love, was not the person she had believed her to be. "It was an accident," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "James had discovered the extent of my family's corruption, and he wanted me to go to the authorities with him. I was scared, confused. We argued, and he fell. I never meant for it to happen, Sarah. You have to believe me." Sarah stood frozen, unable to reconcile the woman before her with the mother she thought she knew. "Why?" she choked out. "Why take me in now? Why all of this?" Eleanor moved towards her daughter, her arms outstretched, but Sarah flinched away. "Because I loved your father, Sarah. And I love you. Everything I've done, the foundation, fighting against my family, it's all been for you. To make the world a better place for you, to atone for what I'd done." As Sarah struggled to process this revelation, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. The door burst open, and Michael Blackwood strode in, flanked by two burly men. Well, he said, his cold eyes taking in the scene before him. "It seems the family reunion isn't going quite as planned." Sarah's mind raced. How had he known where to find them? Then, with a sickening realization, she remembered the car that had seemed to be following her, the feeling of being watched. They had been on to her and Eleanor all along. Michael turned to Eleanor, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "Did you really think you could hide her from us forever, dear sister? Did you think we wouldn't recognize our own blood?" Sarah's head snapped towards Eleanor, fresh shock washing over her. "Sister? You're a Blackwood?" Eleanor's face crumpled in pain and regret. "I was, once. But I left that life behind when I met your father. When I chose love over family loyalty." Michael scoffed. "And look where that got you. Your lover dead, your daughter lost to you for years, and now." He pulled out a gun, pointing it casually between Eleanor and Sarah. "Now, you'll both pay the price for your betrayal." In that moment, as Sarah stared down the barrel of the gun, time seemed to slow. She saw her life flash before her eyes, her struggles in the foster system, her determination to make something of herself, the cruel twist of fate that had led her to Eleanor, and the web of lies and deceit that had entangled them both. But even as fear threatened to paralyze her, Sarah felt a surge of strength. She was more than just a waitress, more than a lost orphan, more than a pawn in this twisted family drama. She was Sarah Thompson, daughter of James Thompson and Eleanor Whitmore, and she would not go down without a fight. With a speed she didn't know she possessed, Sarah lunged for the heavy crystal decanter on Eleanor's desk. As Michael's finger tightened on the trigger, she hurled the decanter at him with all her might. The resulting chaos was a blur of motion and sound. The decanter struck Michael's arm, sending his shot wide. Eleanor tackled one of the henchmen, her years of pent-up rage and guilt fueling her attack. Sarah grappled with the other, her waitressing muscles proving surprisingly useful as she fought for her life. In the midst of the struggle, Sarah's hand closed around the USB drive in her pocket. With a surge of clarity, she realized that the evidence gathered by her and Eleanor, combined with Amanda's revelations, was their way out. As sirens wailed in the distance, drawn by the sound of the gunshot, Sarah managed to break free. She ran to Eleanor's computer, jammed in the USB drive, and with shaking hands, sent its contents to every news outlet and law enforcement agency she could think of. By the time the police burst into the penthouse, it was all over. Michael and his men were subdued, Eleanor was bruised but alive, and Sarah stood tall, her chin held high as she faced the officers. "I have a story to tell you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "About corruption, about family, about truth and lies. And I have the evidence to back it all up." In the days that followed, the Blackwood Empire crumbled. The evidence Sarah and Eleanor had gathered, combined with the revelations on Amanda's USB drive, was damning. Michael and his associates were arrested, their illegal dealings exposed for all the world to see. As for Sarah and Eleanor, their relationship was forever changed. The truth had come at a high cost, shattering the idealized image Sarah had built of her mother. But as they sat together in the aftermath, bruised and exhausted but alive, Sarah realized that perhaps this raw, honest version of their relationship was stronger than the illusion had ever been. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you," Sarah said softly, looking into her mother's tear-filled eyes. "But I understand now. The choices you made, the weight you've carried. I want to try to move forward. Together." Eleanor reached out, gently taking Sarah's hand in her own. "That's all I can ask for, my darling. A chance to make things right, to be the mother you always deserved." As they sat there, the first light of dawn breaking over the New York skyline, Sarah Thompson, once a humble waitress, now the heir to a complicated legacy, realized that her journey was far from over. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, truly known. And with that knowledge came a strength she had never imagined possible. In the months that followed, Sarah and Eleanor worked tirelessly to reshape the Whitmore Foundation, using their resources and influence to help those affected by the Blackwood's corruption. Sarah finished her degree in social work, bringing fresh insights and passion to the Foundation's programs. The story of the waitress turned heiress who had brought down one of New York's most powerful families became the stuff of legend. But for Sarah, the true victory wasn't in the headlines or the accolades. It was in the quiet moments, sharing a cup of coffee with Eleanor, mentoring young people who reminded her of herself, and slowly, painstakingly, building the kind of life and family she had always dreamed of. As she stood at the podium at the grand reopening of the Whitmore Foundation, Sarah looked out over the sea of faces, colleagues, friends, and those whose lives had been touched by their work. Her gaze found Eleanor, standing proudly in the front row, and Sarah felt a swell of emotion. "Life has a funny way of surprising us," she began, her voice strong and clear. "It can humble us, challenge us, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, it can offer us second chances. Today, we're not just reopening a foundation. We're opening our hearts to the possibility of change, of redemption, of a future where every person, no matter their background, has the chance to write their own story. As applause filled the room, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The journey from humiliated waitress to empowered changemaker had been long and fraught with pain. But standing there, embracing her true identity and the complex legacy that came with it, Sarah knew that every step had been worth it. For in the end, it wasn't about the name she carried or the wealth she had inherited. It was about the choices she made, the lives she touched, and the love she had found, both for herself and for the imperfect, beautiful family she had discovered along the way. And as she stepped down from the podium, enveloped in Eleanor's embrace and surrounded by the warmth of applause, Sarah Thompson knew that this was just the beginning of her story. A story of resilience, of redemption, and of the transformative power of truth and love.